In this episode, the Starlet's getting a new drive shaft, and we're going to finish up the fuel system. Stay tuned. So I need to use this vent hose. I need a vent to the tank. So the tank is pretty easy. Let's see, what are these? I think they're -10. 10 fittings were welded to this tank when I got it. So for the tank, all I needed was a -10 female to -10 push lock 90-degree fitting. And we're pretty much made right there. And -10 is the same thing as 5/8. Get some of my magic slider stuff. I use this as silicone lubricant because it usually doesn't hurt like rubber plastic stuff. So that's why I like to use this for these kind of. And so this is vapor line. 5/8 vapor line was kind of hard to find, so maybe order that online would be my suggestion. And then I have this T, and this guy I'm gonna have to tap to fit this attachment so that I can bring one of the hoses. This is -6, which is also 3/8 line. I'm gonna bring the vent hose to the charcoal canister. Let's go tap this guy. Then I can hook up the vapor lines. Alright, so the first step I need to do is I'm going to check this up in my vise. Some pretty thick metal, that's the reason why I got this guy. Let's actually bring it out a little bit because I need to cut off this tube right here. This is actually a heater T. I'll give you the info on where I got it, but it was like $11 from Advanced Auto Parts is where I got it. I'm going to turn it back now. So this is the guy that needs a screw in here. You can see we got a lot more material that needs to be added to this guy to make it work. So I'm going to go get my taps. I think it's a 3/8 MPT that this guy is. We'll go check. Alright, so it looks like this is 1/4 MPT, not 3/8. This looks to be 454 29/64, maybe. So I don't think I have a proper size tap driver for this, so I'm just using a crescent wrench. Obviously this is not correct. Alright, I think that'll work. I think we got some good threads on there. Now, when I put this in here, this is going to partially block the flow, but we're just dealing with vapor here, so I'm not worried. I don't think it's going to get clogged up too much, just with the expanding and contracting of the fuel vapor. So I'm not worried about that in this case. Also, look at the tiny orifice we have here. I don't think we're going to. That's going to be our smallest bottleneck right here. Anytime we're dealing with tapered pipe thread, you want to make sure to use some sort of Teflon or thread sealer. I think right about there is plenty good. And then this guy will go on top. So it's not quite as compact as I would want, but it adapts the 5/8 to the 3/8, because 3/8 is -6 and push fitting line. So yeah, go install this in the car. Alright, so back to this setup. So I'm going to need to cut this vapor line. So I have enough to connect it back over here. That actually worked out really well because this guy's just going to come right down around and match up with these other fuel lines. Alright, that's our setup for the vapor system.
Alright, so I'm here underneath the car. Here's my setup. I got my my filter, and it's going to end up shooting. We're going to come around the back side and then go into here, and I'm just going to kind of shoot the gap in between right here for both my return and my feed lines.
Here I've got my evap charcoal canister, which I was going to put in the engine bay, but I just ran out of room, so I think it's going to work nicely back here by the fuel tank. Here I have my fuel pump bracket that I'm just making a base for that I can weld to the car.
Something like that works out pretty good. Isn't quite what I was going for. Unfortunately, I need more of an angle. Okay, I'm liking that. Just a little more angle. Good screwdriver. Right there.
I bent that double 45 angle shape so that the piece of metal could clear the charcoal canister lid. I put a little lip on the bottom of the bracket because it actually catches the bottom of the canister. I decided to mount the canister bracket right here. Got to do a quick little notch and it'll be good to go. I decided to weld a little support leg at the bottom of the mount, both to stiffen it up and so the hose clamp wouldn't slide off.
It's a little hot, that'll sit right there.
Yep, so loop right there. Alright, so this guy's 4-inch. I think it might barely work. Or not quite, one of the two. Nice. Alright, that's a pretty solid connection right there. Let's see here. Let me go ahead and remove this guy. This 1/4-inch hose. This is an old tube. Alright, so we'll get a little bit longer 1/4-inch.
So here I'm adapting the 3/8 tank side vapor line to the 1/4-inch charcoal canister line. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't use a dash 490 where I teed off of the vent line. That way I could just use 1/4 line all the way to the charcoal canister. But I did have these fittings laying around, so it's not a huge deal.
Alright, there's my setup. I think that'll work pretty good. There's my vent setup anyway. Tighten that guy down right there.
I think this guy right here is my
Surge port, which I'm not sure if I have to block that off or not. For now, I'm just gonna leave it. Like I said, until we figure out how everything's gonna interact with each other. The next thing is working on the feed line from the tank. Alright, so I'm still waiting on some fittings for the return. So the return will be this guy, and the feed will be this guy right here. As I mentioned before, this is cantilever. This will eventually get changed, but for right now I'm leaving it. And I have a -10 to -A&6 adapter for this guy. So I'm using this adapter. I initially was going to try to bend hardline around this, but I realized you just need expensive tools, and that's not something in the budget right now. So I got my adapter on here. I got another one for here, but like I said, we'll deal with that when I get some more fittings. And then this is another AN6. So I'm gonna use a 90 adapter here, and I got my straight connector. Well, oh yeah, here we go. Yep, that's AN. Okay. You always have to make sure. Sometimes they're not O-ring boss. Sometimes if they don't end with this lip here, they're O-ring boss rather than AN. So I got that. That'll come around here like so. All right. So I got my 90 here. Something like right there. Alright, so the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut the ends off. So I'm gonna take this guy. I don't know, maybe this is made to cut off, I don't really know, but I'm just gonna redo it myself to make sure it's good to go. So I'm gonna really tightly wrap this.
Getting my fittings ready to go. I used an assortment of AN fittings for this project, and they all are a little bit different. Some have an internal lip. I think this Russell one had threads, so you kind of have to thread it on, the stainless steel braided line. And they're all kind of had their own trick. There's some tricks that work with all the fittings, like making sure that you have your fitting ready to go when you unwrap your tape. That way it doesn't have time to fully expand before you insert it. And also just getting a really good wrap and clean cut. I'll go into more detail on some of the fittings. It wasn't until I started practicing with these fittings off camera that I was able to finally get them installed.
Alright, so now it's time for some fuel regulator madness. I picked out this location for my regulator. I'm pretty sure it's going to clean the hood. It really looks like it will. I don't think this is higher than anything else. We'll see, I guess, when I drill it out. Will be good. I kind of bent the bracket back so it's going to be as level as possible. And the only way I could figure to get these this to attach is, well, there's lots of ways, I guess, but I'm using through bolts. From the back side, I got an Allen key. Let's see. Enlarge that hole a bit. So that looks pretty good in there. More importantly, does the hood close? I think it should be fine, but good to check. Cool. So the hood closes. So the other thing to kind of mention is how I'm running these fuel lines. So here is where the original feed went for the fuel. It's right here on the fuel rail. These are kind of a weird thread size. I'll post in the description what they are. I can't remember off the top of my head. One did come with this kit, so that was good. And then I ordered another one for the back side right here. Now these are like O-ring style or washer style. They're not AN where they have the lip, the flange on them to seal. So what I'm using is I grabbed O-rings. I'm not sure if this is the best method. We'll see, I guess. But I grabbed 20 by 3 millimeter O-rings. And so that's what I'm using to kind of seal everything off. And they adapt to 6 AN. So that goes in the back. That'll be our return. Our feed will go in right here, and this back one will actually go to the to our regulator, and then on the sides. So all the sides measure the regulated pressure, or give you regulated pressure, and the bottom is the return spring. So that guy will just go right back to the tank. So it's really a pretty slick setup. We'll be able to see on this gauge right here and adjust the fuel pressure. So now I need to run the lines if the fuel tank to the fuel rail, and if the regulator to the tank. Okay, so I'm waiting for parts again, but there is one fuel fitting that I can run. So I'm gonna go ahead and make that line while I wait for parts.
I'm measuring out for the line that goes from the back of the fuel rail to the regulator.
We take it all off. And just get one side started.
Like I said before, there's a ton of different AN style fittings. This is the method that worked the best for me for the cheap fittings that came with my regulator.
Okay. And then there's a spot in there that you kind of shove it to. And mine is shoved into the ring that you shove it to. Let me kind of give you a close up. There's a couple different ledges in there, and you want to go to where basically this is the part that you insert. This is the part that goes into the tube, and this part right here needs to have a space in that in this nut. So there will be kind of a gap right there, but there'll be a lip where, I don't know if you can see that, but the edge of the tubing is touching that lip. And you can actually, if you twist and push, you can push this thing past it, but you'll never get it to seal if you do that. So just wait until it gets to that lip, and then you can mark your tube. Mark your tube to make sure that nothing pushes out when you're screwing it in. I'm gonna use a little bit of lube just to make sure it inserts into the rubber. I want to be able to push on the hose so it doesn't kind of push out. Alright, it's very close. I'm going to go ahead and call that good for this end. You can see there's very little movement on this side of the fitting. If I try to pull it out, it's good, it's not trying to come out. So I'll unwrap that when I blow out the hose to get all the gunk out of the lines.
I refit up the line just to double check my length and repeated the process on the other end.
Go ahead and blow these out with compressed air. So this guy should fit on here perfectly, right? Yeah, so it just barely fits. Pretty tight, and also this, I think that's the air inlet. Looks like it's gonna need to be trimmed back. It's hard to see, but this right here is the air inlet that I was talking about. It's rubbing right here on our fuel line, so I'll have to trim that back, possibly relocate it. So I also marked out here my air intake horn, where I need to grind on that guy. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's going to be a lot better. The rest of the things I want to address is centering this guy up. So this is vertical. So I'm going to try to wrap a bunch of Teflon tape around here to see if I can get it tighter sooner. Alright, so it's about 2 turns Teflon tape. See, it's still not tight. It's like it bottoms out before it's tight enough. Okay, that seemed like a lot. Try that. Alright, I think that's gonna do it. We're pretty tight at that point. So I think I'm gonna call that good. Trapped a bunch of Teflon tape. We're not like super tight, but I don't think it's gonna leak. So while I got this out, I'll make sure these other fittings are tight. Now that I have all my fuel fittings, I'm ducking underneath the light. I'm gonna make my hose that is gonna go here. It's just kind of like a random length that came with a pressure regulator. This 90 right here is actually gonna go on my fuel cell. And then this is just gonna kind of sit in between here before it gets to the fuel rail. It's gonna be hanging right down in there somewhere. I'll use this guy, this 90 and a straight, and I'll come back with a completed line. Alright, so I got my line here. One thing I'm going to note is that I was using different style and fittings than the ones that came with my pressure regulator, and they were definitely more difficult to get on in a certain way because there wasn't like a lip on there that kind of stops where the shove in. I mean, there was, but you couldn't just shove them straight on. You had to kind of like, you could barely get them in, and then you had to kind of turn it. Definitely took some getting used to, but I finally got them in. So first I'm going to screw on this guy. My filter. I don't think there's a certain way you're supposed to screw this on. Hopefully there's not. There's no arrow. So that's going in right before the fuel rail. The car there.
Now that I ran all the short AN lines in the engine bay, I can start running the main lines that will run the length of the car.
I think it's nylon. It's nobody puts on line like sir. Nylon tubing, 25 feet, 3/8.
So I really wanted to use nylon line for the main lines on my car, just because that's what the factory uses, and I know that these AN lines look really cool, but at least the ones I'm using are rubber lined. You can get Teflon line that doesn't deteriorate with newer ethanol type fuels, but rubber eventually does. Nylon is smooth inside rather than rubber, which is more of a restriction, but it was very difficult to find fittings that would work. The fittings you see me trying to install here are for AN push line that you just push the line onto, and it works for high pressure applications. But what I have is the steel braided stuff, which does not work with. After several different trials and errors, I was able to find 2 different fittings that would work for nylon line. So after I tried the push lock fitting, I tried this fitting from Jegs, and this also does not work for nylon tubing. The first fitting I was able to get working was this ICT Billet Fitting, which is a male barb to male AN fitting. I'll have a link in the description. I was also able to use a female AN to male barbed Derale fitting.
You see they come as a 2-piece deal, have very small barbs on them to kind of help make sure the tube doesn't back out on it. So I have an AN, any AN fitting would work to kind of just help keep this pressed out. And I'm just going to kind of, I got everything kind of cleaned up as much as I can. I've kind of like, just kind of work it around here just to get it started. So it kind of like flares out your nylon a little bit. Because I'm going to try to do this in one quick go. Alright, here we go.
working it down with trying not to bend it. Take this guy off, and this line is done. I'm gonna have to run this, continue this feed line. And before I do this, I'm gonna go ahead and put my return line adapter on here.
This is the Dash 6 AN90.
Yeah, I think that's the angle I want right there, so they'll both sweep up a little bit. So you can see I'm trying to snake the fuel line right there, kind of over the axle. I'm gonna go bring in my nylon line.
You can see on the end of the fuel pump I have a check valve just to make sure the fuel pump always has fuel in it.
Alright, so now that I got one line run, I can go ahead and run my other line. This is my return, just going in parallel. I'm not going to tighten this guy because I have to remove it to cut the line. So that line doesn't look too terrible. I'm going to zip tie it kind of where I think it needs to go.
After I ran that line, I marked it and cut it to length so I could put a fitting on the other end.
Yeah, that kind of swirling motion seems to kind of work pretty good. Alright, so I've got my return line all ready to go now. So I'm just reach underneath here and it's screwing to the bottom of my pressure regulator here. She started and in there. See if I can get my adjustable wrench in here. Alright. My return is tightened. So that's my whole fuel system plumbed.
Next, I just want to do a quick survey of the drive shaft on the car. First, I made sure that the car was sitting at ride height with the suspension fully loaded. This means that nothing is supported by jack stands, just the weight of the suspension. Then I made note of the angle of the car, and I made sure that the pinion and the tail shaft of the transmission had equal and opposite angles relative to the angle that the car was sitting. My angles were actually a couple degrees off, but I know I'm going to be redoing the engine mounts in this car. I have a little bit of play with the pinion angle on the rear end because I have an adjustable 4-link setup. I then bolted the flange yoke onto the pinion flange and slid the slip yoke into the tail shaft of the transmission.
It's interesting. I don't know if that's like a seal or what, how that exactly works, but it's kind of interesting. Okay. So from this flange thing to the center is about, there's an inch, there's 3/4. Yeah, right about 3/4. I'm just trying to see when it engages. So it engages, I mean, a little bit before here, but let's be conservative here. That means all the way butted to the flange. That's 4 1/4 right there. So if you subtract 3/4 from that, you have 3.5 inches of engagement when you're fully compressed.
The reason I was doing this measurement is I wanted to see what kind of engagement I would get with different slip yoke clearances. So you can't have your drive shaft, fit completely tightly in there, otherwise you won't be able to install the rear flange. All the drive shaft places that I quoted in my area told me to leave around 3/4 to an inch of clearance. Since all the way pushed in, my slip yoke has 3.5 inches of engagement. If I pulled that out 1 inch, I'd still have 2.5 inches. I decided to shoot in the middle of that clearance range at 7/8 of an inch. That would give me 2 5/8 inches of engagement. Now that I had a target clearance, I decided to pull the slip yoke out to that clearance and then measure from the pinion flange to the center of the U-joint on the slip yoke.
So that looks pretty money on 1 5/8".
1 5/8 is my base point with my 7/8 inches of clearance added in. You definitely don't want to rush this whole measuring process. Double check everything because drive shafts are pretty expensive. This one ran me about $300. The reason I installed the rear flange yoke is because some drive shaft shops want the center U-joint to center U-joint measurement, but all the shops I called wanted the center of the slip yoke U-joint to the rear pinion flange measurement.
42 1/4.
Alright, so I ended up going with 42 3/16 just to give myself the extra 1/16 of a shortened room. I think the slip yoke's got plenty of engagement at that point, so that's what I'm gonna go with. Go take it to the drive shaft shop, and in a few days we should have a new drive shaft. So I got the new drive shaft. Here you can see me kind of test fitting it up. You can see that it has a little bit different style slip yoke. It doesn't have that cup seal type thing, so I'm not sure if that'll be a problem. If anybody knows, definitely comment below. I'd be really interested to see what that's for. The drive shaft shop ran a 1310 series U-joint on both ends of this drive shaft, which was actually an upgrade for the slip yoke side. You can see that the distance between the shifter and the U-joint is a lot tighter than it used to be. It still clears, luckily, but it's pretty close tolerance there.
The original one, you can see, is much wimpier. Okay, so this old slip yoke, you can see here that it's pressed in. There's little dimples in here, which kind of press the U-joint inside of this yoke here, which is pretty interesting, really. Which means it's non-replaceable. I don't know if there's a way to replace that. Maybe the guys at the drive shaft shop were ripping me off. I don't think they were, because they did a pretty good job, and I got a beefer U-joint, so I'm not all that mad about it. But yeah, both of these from this old shaft that were, like plasma cut off or whatever.
Alright, so now that the drive shaft was buttoned in, it was time to button up the fuel lines. You can see that when I first ran them, I just kind of zip tied them in place. But after that, it was time to use some rubber cushion clamps. So what I did was I drilled a hole from the bottom. I then inserted M6 bolts from the top side and welded the top to the floor, making sure to kind of pull the fuel lines away so they didn't get melted. After everything cooled off, I was ready to mount my cushion clamps. I mounted them in parallel so one bolt can mount the return and feed lines. So that's pretty much a wrap on the fuel system, but let's do a quick recap. So first, I use a 100 micron filter that goes before the fuel pump. Then, after the fuel pump, I use a check valve to make sure that once the fuel pump gets fuel in it, it stays in there and doesn't run dry. That's really bad for electric fuel pumps. Then it goes all the way up to right before the rail, where I use a 30 micron filter. Now, I've seen guys, I've been recommended a 10 micron filter, but for some reason I bought a 30 micron filter for this. We'll see how that works out in the long term. So then that goes into the fuel rail, then out the other side with the return line. The return line goes to the high pressure side of the regulator, which is set to 62 psi in this application. Then it goes back unmetered to the fuel tank. And the other thing to add is our vent system. So anytime you have any kind of liquid tank, it needs some means to vent, because as the fluid evacuates, air needs to fill the empty void. Otherwise, it's like squeezing all the soap out of a soap container. It just kind of like compresses in because there's no means for the air to escape. It needs some way to vent, and the best way to do that is with a factory-style charcoal filter. And so that's what I'm using. I'm not using the purge functionality yet, but hopefully I can integrate that in the future. That's going to be it for this one. This car is really starting to come together. I hope to see you next time.